Hello everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to talk about Algorand and what our risk indicator makes of its recent price action. If you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter, where we put out regular updates about our risk indicators and more. So what I'm showing you here is the price history of Algorand over time, color-coded to the output of our risk model, the upside-downside potential indicator. So each dot is a day, and that's what it's color-coded to. So 5 is high risk, and then -5 is low risk. And what you can see is that Algorand, throughout its history, has had kind of these two big bull runs that have kind of capped out at these high-risk zones, these kind of maximum upside potential being realized relative to downside potential. And then what's tended to happen after that for Algorand is that it's kind of moved sideways and then had corrections, and that's happened after both of these rallies that we've seen recently. Now I should note that what I'm showing you here is the long-term UDPI, and so with the UDPI we can actually calibrate it to care about different types of risk. So this model here cares about long-term risks, so really these big macro plays that play out over months is what it cares about. It's not as concerned about kind of intraday or inter-week volatility. It's really caring about kind of these broader market cycle moves going on here. That is what it's trying to track. So one thing I think is kind of interesting about what Algorand has been doing recently is that there's some similarity in its price action now to what happened back in the early 2021 moving into the summer. You know, we had this big parabolic move to the upside in both cases, a little bit larger, you know, going here to here, but still kind of going from these green zones up into the red, both from the summer and back here going into early 2021. And then kind of just sideways actions since then, you know, not being able to reestablish a new kind of all-time high, or at least not a daily close at a new all-time high, before having to go into a correction. And so one thing that we might think is, you know, not to say the history is going to repeat itself or anything like that, but, you know, it doesn't seem totally improbable if we're kind of in this lower leg of whatever the correction is now, and who knows, maybe we need to move lower, maybe we need to move higher. But you'll notice that we've started to re-enter the green zone here. And so what would be interesting is if we do see this kind of play out, where we kind of have to move sideways a bit more, maybe we even have to drop down a bit more, enter into these deeper greens, but that might just be setting us up for that next move back into the upside. Now, of course, who knows what's going to happen? You know, a lot of this is dependent on the broader crypto market. You know, Algorand is to some degree at the mercy of what, you know, some of the bigger players like Bitcoin do. If Bitcoin just keeps dumping, tends to drag the rest of the market down with it. Although we'll have to see what happens. If Bitcoin's able to just keep moving sideways, or especially if Bitcoin starts moving more bullish, then I would expect that might be when Algorand could really shine, could really put some moves to the upside. But we'll have to wait and see what happens. So as I mentioned, we have different time frames we can look at with UDPI, and that's what I'm showing you here in these graphs. So I was just showing you here the long-term UDPI. We can also take a look at what the medium-term and the short-term UDPIs are telling us. So medium-term tends to look at movements that play out over weeks to months, so not quite as far looking as the long-term UDPI. And the short-term UDPI is tracking movements that happen over days just to weeks, so significantly shorter time frame that it's really paying attention to. So you'll see that it's reacting more quickly to some of these smaller movements in volatility because it cares more about this short-term potential risk. And you know, there'll be some synchrony that'll happen at these kind of extreme points, but you'll see that overall it's kind of reacting more to this kind of lower level volatility, whereas the long-term UDPI, for example, really cares about these sweeping moves across time. And we see some interesting things, and I think we can visualize some of the interesting things these are telling us just by looking at the different UDPIs in tandem. So this is the raw output of each of the time frame UDPIs. So y-axis here is its UDPI level, long-term, medium-term, short-term. And I think these tell us some interesting things. So the one thing that you'll note is that the long-term UDPI is actually at the lowest level currently, so it's sitting here below -1, whereas for the other ones, the medium term is between -1 and 0, and the short term is also between -1 and 0. And I'll show the exact values for these in a minute of what they are currently, but that's just kind of roughly where they stand right now. And so one way that we could interpret this is that for the long-term UDPI's perspective, as Algorand keeps consolidating, or especially if it has to correct down further, it's just seeing more and more upside potential coming in the long term. The more that Algorand has to consolidate and move to the downside, the more that the model is believing that the realistic downside potential is getting eaten up kind of as it falls down, and then there's greater realistic upside potential in the longer term that it thinks is plausible for Algorand. And I think it's also just interesting to look at the shape of this graph. You'll note this kind of overall macro uptrend we've been in so far for Algorand, where we've been kind of, for the tops, we've been putting in higher tops. The bottoms had kind of been at about the same level. And then we kind of flipped it. So then the tops were going at the same level, but it seems like, at least so far, we might be putting in a higher low in risk here, which might just mean that Algorand doesn't need to kind of chew up as much realistic downside potential before it can put in a base to put in a move to the upside. Now, who knows? That's speculation. It could be that long-term risk for Algorand will continue to fall, maybe especially if Algorand has to correct a bit further before it can move back to the upside, in which case we might be looking more at this -3 as a potentially interesting zone to see if it kind of has a similar touch, sort of like it did back here, where it was very much -5 that offered the space before big runs. Who knows, maybe -3 will be important later. We'll have to keep an eye on that if we do end up approaching that. But it wouldn't surprise me at all also if we do put in a higher kind of low, being lowest low, second lowest low, then maybe even a higher low before we can put more upside in. It's just really going to depend, I think, on what broader market conditions will allow for. I think it's unlikely for Algorand to go crazy while the rest of the market is bearish. So I think we're going to have to see kind of broader improvement in sentiment before Algorand can run. But the bigger question with Algorand is in my opinion, does it need to correct further before sentiment, basically waiting it out until sentiment does improve in the market and then moving it up, or we'll have to correct further. We'll have to wait and see. And so in the medium term and the short term, these models are a little bit more undecided about where Algorand is going. Kind of what I was mentioning here is, in the medium term, this model thinks there is more upside than downside potential, but you can see that it's not, as decided about that. It's hovering close to zero. And so basically in its mind, it could go either way. That in the medium term, it would be totally reasonable for Algorand to go up in price. It would also be totally reasonable for it to have to move down or to correct in price from there, or to consolidate. It's kind of undecided. It's not really pointing heavily in one direction or the other. And the same thing with the short term, which might not be that surprising. That in its mind, there's not really anything that's telling it that moves to the upside or the downside might be more realistic, or that there's more realistic up versus downside potential. It thinks that it could go either way as well. And so I think my overall interpretation with this is that in the long term, right now, that it's overall a bullish bias, not extremely so, but overall a bullish bias, being below -1 and falling. And so in the long term, I think that's a good outlook for Algorand potentially. But in the medium and short term, who knows? I think that's what this is suggesting, at least to me. But again, none of this is financial advice. You should make your own decisions about where you think the market is for Algorand and, what you should do based on that information. But one other thing I did want to mention, more kind of on a fundamental perspective, that I think is really important and helps us maybe explain some of the past price history that Algorand has experienced, is this accelerating vesting program that had been ongoing for Algorand and only completed back in October of last year. Now, this is was kind of an important aspect of Algorand that I don't know if that many people knew about. Certainly the people really into Algorand were probably all totally aware of this, knew what was going on, but the more casual investor might not have been aware that this was kind of part of the Algorand tokenomics in a sense for a while. So essentially what this program was that there's kind of a broader backstory, but essentially there was a resolution that got passed with Algorand where essentially in exchange for early backers agreeing to delay how quickly they'd get their full allotment of Algorand in exchange for their early financial support, their early backing of Algorand. Basically, they agreed to delay that to kind of help slow down inflation of Algorand, but then in return, there was this program that was put in place that if the price of Algorand got above kind of if the 30-day moving average of the Algorand price got above its prior all-time high, it would trigger this kind of accelerated vesting where those early investors would get a chunk of that kind of delayed vesting moved up, so they get those tokens more quickly than they would normally if the price of Algorand hadn't been setting those all-time highs on the 30-day average basis. And one of the things that was likely doing for Algorand throughout its history, at least since that resolution had been put in place, was creating sell-side pressure as Algorand went into price discovery. So as Algorand went on these parabolic moves here, what that would mean is that as the 30-day moving average would suddenly break an all-time high and keep moving up as the price went up, what that would do is it would then accelerate how many ALGO tokens those early investors were getting, that they were just receiving, and then they could go in and sell onto the open market if they chose to. And the thing is, for those early investors, they were probably sitting well in profit at that point when Algorand was breaking all-time highs. That's kind of how it usually works. If a token's breaking its all-time highs or putting in new highs, that will lead early investors to be in profit along with every other market participant. As a new all-time high gets set, everyone's in profit until it's no longer an all-time high. So that's probably creating a lot of sell pressure. A lot of those early investors are probably just dumping those new tokens onto the market as soon as they were getting them because they wanted to lock in that profit as Algorand was showing strength. And so that could have been serving to blunt Algorand's price action through its history, that as it did these parabolic moves, that might be why, as the vesting would happen, maybe that's partly why the sideways kind of action would happen, that it couldn't keep pushing back up to the upside, because, this would unlock a whole bunch of new supply that was likely, at least a chunk of it, just getting put onto the market. And then that would, soak up a lot of the demand and stop price from keeping on appreciating. And that could have been happening throughout. But what's important is that this program is now complete. This is no longer active. All of the tokens that were going to be distributed as part of this accelerated vesting program have now happened. That's already transpired as of last October. And I think this is fantastic news for Algorand, frankly, because there's two things that kind of happen. One, a big chunk of Algorand's total supply, which is going to be ultimately 10 billion, is now out there. 6.7 billion algos out there, so that means that over 2/3 of the total supply is now in circulation, which is great because that means only 1/3 of the total supply is left to dilute kind of the supply, to inflate the supply before is a fixed number of algo that exist. And of course, less inflation is good for price. The less that there's new supply entering the market, the less supply there is to soak up demand, and then that should help price increase. That might help create a better environment for kind of these supply squeezes that can lead to big explosions in price. And then if you add that to the fact that this accelerated investing program is complete, meaning that there won't be a kind of a deluge of new tokens entering the market at these points when Algorand's going into price discovery, that might mean that the next run Algorand's able to put in could pump further. There's not going to be as much to stop a pump as there was before from just a mechanical perspective because this program is now complete. Now, who knows what's going to happen? That doesn't guarantee that the next Algorand pump is going to be some, blow your socks off insane run. But it certainly is more likely now that this program is complete than when before it was complete, in my opinion. So just something to be aware of. If you've been following Algorand closely, you probably already knew about all this. But just in case you weren't aware, I think this is just an important thing to keep in mind. And it might just mean that Algorand could act a little bit differently in the future during those really bullish phases. So to wrap us up, I just want to give the exact levels of the Algorand UDPIs across the different time points or time frames. So for the long term, it's negative 1.42, medium term, negative 0.65, and short term, negative 0.47. And this is just what it's done over the last 30 days. And so as I was mentioning, my overall read of this is that in the long term, the UDPI kind of has an overall bullish bias. I think there's more upside than downside potential that's likely, but not to preclude the possibility of more of this downside being realized in the long term. It just thinks that there's more upside potential that's realistic than downside in the long term. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But I definitely expect that if Algorand just continues to kind of go sideways, or especially if it starts correcting, it'll kind of start chewing up some of this downside potential that the model thinks is realistic, and then that'll just leave more upside potential that seems realistic. And then again, with medium term and short term, more undecided. And essentially what it just means that the model kind of is agnostic. It doesn't really have a strong bias in terms of which way things might go in the medium to short term. It thinks that's plausible for it to go either way. So it'll just be interesting to watch. And then certainly, if Algorand starts going crazy one way or the other, I would expect these to start updating as well as the long term. So just something that we'll be keeping an eye on here. So again, none of this is financial advice. Just form your own opinions about how to navigate these markets, but just this is what the data is telling me right now. If you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter. And remember, with the UDPI, we're all going to make it.